All right, folks, good afternoon. Well, depending on where you are. On the East Coast, it's the afternoon. And I'm pleased to present Jerry Rosenthal, going to talk about application of continuous improvement in non-manufacturing areas. So along with Ellen Ermer, I'm co-chair for webinars, Manny Veloso, and I've got a few slides that you may have seen before if you've been on these in the past, but let me see if I can get it there. So the next webinar is going to be in November. Rosa Melton is going to present Lean Where You Least Expect It. And I've been participating in that presentation. It looks like it's going to be really, really very interesting. You can expect to get your RUs typically the next day, and we'll be putting the video up on YouTube, hopefully by Friday. So if you want to ask a question, if you're not familiar with the controls on GoToWebinar, you can see here, it's on the right-hand side, your control panel. You can just go to questions and type them in. I will be monitoring that along with chat, and we're looking forward to as many questions as we can at the end, and looking forward to this really being a great session. So here's a little bit about Jerry. I'm not going to read this off to you, but he is the author of Small Doses, which is available on Amazon as well as Barnes & Noble. And it's really a great book, okay, because it's very practical. It's not technical really, but it's some really neat insight. Jerry has worked for some very serious companies: Cardinal Health, GlaxoSmithKline, Dun & Bradstreet, Thomas Jefferson University Hospitals. And Jerry has spent a lot of his career in healthcare and legal operations, as well as teaching, like so many of us do. So Jerry, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I'm going to make you the presenter, and feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you, Manny. Thank you, Ellen. So let me first make sure you guys can see my screen. Are we good, Manny?
Yes, you'll just have to
Great.
kick it in presentation mode. There, you got it.
Okay. So today's topic is it's not all about manufacturing. So how did we get here? So I've been an active member of the Lean Enterprise Division for quite some time, and it would seem that most of the presentations to me, and maybe I'm biased, have had a bit of a manufacturing bias. Which is great. I cut my teeth in manufacturing, but I think there's more to the world. There's more to implementing lean than just in a manufacturing environment. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I want to talk about, give a little example just to start out the presentation. So I live in Philadelphia, and you can see here a picture of Hahnemann Hospital, which really, it doesn't exist anymore in Philadelphia. And the process I want to talk about is called the credentialing process. Maybe some of you know what that is, and some of you don't know what that is. And let me just talk about that a little bit. So Hahnemann Hospital was a level 1 trauma center, and they filed for bankruptcy last year. They'd been open for 170 years, and it was a 385 bed hospital. It was a teaching hospital. I think they had about 300 interns and residents. The last financial information I have on the institution was that they had about $2.5 billion a year in revenue, but $150 million a year in losses. And certainly no organization can continue on that path forever. So certainly they had an opportunity to implement some process improvement methodologies. They didn't, and they closed a little over a year ago. It was in August of last year. And that volume, those 385 beds, that volume had to be displaced to the 3 other hospital networks in the Philadelphia area, which would be Penn or Temple or Jefferson Health. But there's more to the story than just being able to displace those people. You need doctors, nurses, and staff to help support everyone. And so a process was needed to credential doctors more quickly to the new healthcare system. So the credentialing process is one where a hospital or a healthcare system verifies that, you know what, Manny actually went to an accredited medical school. He actually graduated. He passed the exams. He's licensed to practice medicine in Pennsylvania. He's certified in particular areas of medicine. He has active malpractice insurance. There's no disciplinary issues pending against Manny. So typically, prior to the hospital closing, the credentialing process would take anywhere from 2 to 3 months for somebody such as Manny or any other doctor to get certified or credentialed to practice from one hospital to another hospital. And that was simply too long. And so the three major hospitals in the Philadelphia area worked individually and sometimes even collaboratively. How could they improve that process to get it to under 2 weeks? And certainly there's the issue of risk. No new hospital is going to take the risk and say, well, Manny was credentialed at Hahnemann Hospital. It must be okay for him to practice at our healthcare facility. Every hospital, every healthcare network has to do their due diligence to make sure everything is in line. And so you use the process and the tools of Lean. What is the process map? What is the value stream map? Use spaghetti diagrams, use SciPoc, use a variety of tools to be able to validate this process. So again, a non-manufacturing process where the tools of Lean and Six Sigma can be applied to improve the experience. So what are we going to cover today? So my objective for today is to discuss what we do as practitioners. It's to review some fundamental tools. I want to give a couple of examples in healthcare and in law. I want to talk about creating and maintaining a customer mindset, and I want to help tie it all together. So just a little bit about me. So I started my career in pharmaceutical manufacturing, packaging, and distribution on the operations side, a production supervisor, production manager, director of operations. And about 15 years ago, I got introduced to Lean Six Sigma as a process improvement methodology. And I really liked the tool set, I liked the mindset, what it provided. And so I was given an opportunity to get a green belt and then a black belt. And then over the course of time, I moved into legal operations. How do you apply those tools to a legal environment? And I made some mistakes and I learned a few things, but for the most part, I learned that the tools we use, for example, Gemba, Go and See, not only does that work in a manufacturing setting, but it also works very well in a commercial environment. I studied and passed the Master Black Belt exam shortly thereafter. And then for most of the last, we'll say 5 to 7 years, not only have I been working and consulting, but I've written some articles, I've been interviewed in some podcasts. Like Manny mentioned, I wrote a book and I also have a blog. But most importantly, I like to teach, I like to share, I like to learn, from great people like who are on the call today. I like to connect with people and I like to promote. And when I talk about promote, it's not about promoting Jerry Rosenthal, but it's about promoting the tools, the ideas, and the concepts of Lean and Six Sigma. I'm going to make a bold assumption and say that many of us, if not most of us, are on LinkedIn. Maybe like me, you've seen the balance of positive and also negative articles. It seems a couple times a week I come across an article that says Lean and Six Sigma are dead. I don't believe that, but I believe there's an opportunity to continue to promote the tools and the mindset of the work that we do. So where do we begin? So I want to talk a little bit about the basics. I think we're all somewhat biased and we experience what we all call that shiny new object syndrome. Somebody covers a new tool, a new method, a new philosophy, and we say, great, I want to take that and I want to try that in my own environment right away. And that's great, but I think it's incredibly important that we don't forget about the foundational tools of what it is that we do. So what is it that we do? And I think regardless of job title, most of us today who are here today are engaged in the following. We're all about identifying opportunities to reduce cost in cycle time. And I would call that the traditional model of what's lean, what's the lean toolbox, Six Sigma, theory of constraints. It's a very traditional model of improving profitability by reducing costs. I think there's also another side of the coin that I call improving the customer experience. I call it a more modern perspective that not just focused on saving pennies, saving nickels, saving the $50 bills, but it's how do we improve the customer experience so they're more satisfied and they come back and they do more business with us. So let's talk about costs. So I think there's the basic fundamental space of, material costs. Are we buying the right amount of material? Are we buying the correct material? Are we getting the right price? Are we getting good quality material? Direct labor is certainly a cost, time, overhead. It's really focused on those costs. Manny, is there anything that comes to mind for you when we talk about costs? Anything that maybe you think I'm forgetting?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is rework and waiting. Huge wastes.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, those are good ones. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for calling those out. And then there's the other side that we want to talk about, the customer. And more often than not, I think there are not just us. I'm certainly guilty of it. But when we think about the customer, we tend to just only think about the consumer. Who is the ultimately at the end of the supply chain, and that consumer, when we talk about law, would certainly be the client or whatever that entity is. In healthcare, it's the patient, it's the provider, it might be the payer, like the insurance company. But I like to think that there are more customers along the way. Manufacturing and operations, they're a customer, and all of these other ones that we have called out here, they're also customers. Purchasing, warehousing, receiving, shipping. I'm not going to read through all of them there, but all of them are customers of the other. They all receive inputs from another group and they give an output to another group. So if you look at the detailed definition of a customer, somebody who consumes the output from the previous step in the process. And I think within manufacturing, all of these things are all certainly tied together. So how do we do the work that we do? And at a real high level, I think I can summarize it in these steps. We use tools to understand the current state, right? The lean toolbox, which is the toolbox that I play in most of the time. We use those tools. We articulate the gap between the current state and the future state. Here's where we are. Here's where we want to go. This is leadership's vision. And we quantify it. We use data to advise and make decisions. Here's where we are, here's where we want to go, and it may take 6 months or a year to get there. We prioritize actions to bridge the gap. Many organizations, they have 20, 30, 40 perhaps initiatives or strategies. Sometimes I think that's entirely too much, but how do we prioritize and say, what, in Q4 of 2020, we're going to do these few things and we're going to do them extremely well. We engage stakeholders and process owners, right? They're the ones that ultimately get to make the decisions to say, yeah, this is what we want to do. This is where we want to go. We take actions, right? We're the people, the doers, that we build a team, we have a plan, and we use a methodology, whether it's lean or Six Sigma or theory of constraints, whatever it might be, but you have to use some methodology, project management, to get from A to B. And we drive for results, right? KPIs or metrics. And I'll talk a little bit about more later on in the presentation. So let's just set the stage. So for many of us, we learn these tools, Lean, Six Sigma, theory of constraints, and how to apply them in a manufacturing environment. And some of the things we focused on were reducing setup time. Some organizations call it make-ready time or changeover time. We look at reducing downtime, right? If you have a production line, perhaps you've worked in something like printing or in plastics, where downtime is just a killer, and you really want to reduce those things. We look for, what are the common themes? What are the root causes? How do you keep those production lines running? We want to reduce scrap and waste. We want to increase throughput and yield. We want to reduce labor. Perhaps you have a production line that runs with 12 people. Perhaps by laying it out a little differently, we could run that line with 11 people or 10 people and reduce labor costs. And certainly overall, you want to reduce costs and improve margins for the work that you do. And there's tools that we use. And certainly I'm not going to go through every one of these tools. I'm going to assume most of us know what these tools are, but there are a couple that I want to call out. Most notably, that second bullet point, the voices. So if anybody participated last month, I think it was last month, it was last month, there was a great presentation on the new voice of the customer. If you weren't able to attend, I highly recommend you go to our YouTube channel and you watch that, but really focused on voice of the customer and how there are pros and cons and different ways of doing those things. There are other voices that I think are just as important. Voice of the process. I think this falls more into the Six Sigma space. What are your process capabilities? Do you have a process that's capable? I think of calculations like CP, CPK, PP, PPK, Z-score, things like that, and understanding what is the process capable of, and are we asking it to do something that it may or may not be possible to do? VOE, voice of the employee. Do our employees have the right skills, the right knowledge, the expertise to do what they need to do? And if not, how do we get them that right tool set to be able to be wildly successful at what they do? VOB, voice of the business. Every business has an opportunity to define what's the role they want to play in a commercial space. I don't think any of us would go to McDonald's for a slice of pizza. McDonald's has decided they want to be successful in the space of burgers and fries and breakfasts, and they've changed their model to a all-day breakfast model, but not to hot dogs and not to pizza. That's the voice of the business. And for those of us that have worked in regulated fields, VOA is what I call voice of the agency, right? If you've worked in pharmaceuticals or in healthcare, you might have the FDA or the Joint Commission. If you worked in the financial sector, there are also regulating agencies. So it's knowing if you're beyond just making widgets, what are the boundaries? What are the things you can and can't do in the space of your processes? I think most of the others we're all fairly experienced in. I'll call out 5S, right? I learned the tools of 5S years ago. More recently, I've heard some organizations, they use 6S. They've added safety to the program. And some organizations have even added a 7th S, what they call security. And that's both physical security. In the challenging times that we live in, there are some institutions that require physical security, and it also in terms of electronic security. How do we ensure that we're not going to be held hostage for a Bitcoin ransomware type of payment? So I think that plays a huge role. The last one I want to really call out is the space of change management. I think the tools of change management go hand in hand with the work we do. You can't just develop a new process and say, great, starting on October 15th, everybody has to behave differently. You have to have a purposeful, meaningful change model for being able to do the work that we do. Manny, I want to turn it over to you for a second. I know you and I met earlier this year when you gave a presentation on a couple of tools. Are there any you want to call those out? You want to mention any others that you think are really fundamental?
Well, I'm a really big fan of the tools that engage other people, like mind maps and fishbone diagrams in particular. I think it's huge, much better than just writing down things on a flip chart or a whiteboard. And you've actually got the structure to brainstorm and do it effectively, so everybody's engaged. So
yeah, great. I seem to also recall fishbone. I mean, I think that's also another great tool to use. To again, when you're trying to establish where are we and where is it that we want to go. Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. So that was more of the manufacturing mindset. I want to talk a little bit about commercial environments. Some organizations call them, the back office. What are the things that support the engine that cranks stuff out? And so I think all of these groups should have well-defined processes: finance and accounting, sales, marketing, legal operations, human resources, distribution. All of them have processes that can take advantage of the tools that we've talked about already. So let me give some examples here. I think hiring and onboarding, right? All of us at some point in time have been hired and onboarded to an organization. I think there's plenty of opportunity to look at what are our hiring processes? How do we onboard employees? How do we set people up for success, especially in the times we live in now over the last 6 or 7 months? How do we ensure a new employee, if they're working remotely, that they get their cell phone, that they get their laptop, that they're set up for success, that they have orientation meetings and it's a good experience? The performance review process. Again, many organizations, I think, just don't do this well. It's a once-a-year event. It's a system that may not work as well as it could. But how do we make sure it's a good process that meets the needs of everybody? Order fulfillment and shipping. I think that's another good process. The payroll process, right? What happens when there's a payroll error? How good is the organization at getting that corrected and getting that employee paid properly and timely? Accounts payable and accounts receivable process. I think this is a great process, and I'm going to touch on this one a little bit later because I think this one that has more of a bias in that customer experience space, that certainly it can be a manual, it can be an automated process, but this is one of those where if you're focused on improving the customer experience, it becomes a win-win for everybody. CAPA process, for those of you that are not familiar, corrective action and preventive action. You know, when there's an issue, how do you not only correct the issue, but how do you look at it systemically and improve the process? Mortgage and car loan application. Again, most of us, I think, have been through this. And I think if anybody has seen the TV commercials for something like Rocket Mortgage, they've really revolutionized the way you apply for a mortgage and reduce the amount of paperwork that's necessary. So I want to talk a little bit, now that we've laid the foundation, about healthcare and about legal operations. So when I talk healthcare, what that means to me is the space of pharmaceuticals or hospitals, like I talked about at the beginning, or inpatient, as well as clinics, right? Your doctor's office may be in a group of doctor's office, or a clinic where you might just go for some type of outpatient service. We're going to talk about those a little bit. Legal operations, I think of those in two buckets. One is in the space of in-house counsel. You know, an organization, or small or large, they might have an entire legal department. It may be just 1 or 2 attorneys, or it may be a whole group of attorneys. If it's a large enough organization, you may have to deal with things like employment and labor law. You may have to deal with litigation. You may have to deal with patent protection. You may have to deal with intellectual property and promotional activities. So there's that. And then there's law firms, right, where companies decide they want to outsource it, and where they're just focused on clients. In a more modern view, it's partnerships. It's not a one-way street. It's, you know, how do you build that relationship? How do you build that partnership to do more than just that single transaction, but that lifetime of transactions? So let's talk about healthcare a little bit. So when I think of healthcare or a hospital environment, there are a few processes that come to mind that I wanted to just plant some seeds and share with the group. And these are primarily processes I wanted to just talk about briefly, because I think they're all ones that we can all relate to them. They've all impacted us in some way. So the registration process, what's that? So you have a procedure that's scheduled, and you show up at the hospital. They say, Manny or Ellen, you have to be at the hospital at 1 o'clock on Tuesday. So great, you get there early, you fill out paperwork, you sit in a waiting room. Perhaps you're not quite sure where to go. You go to a desk. They say you're up on the 3rd floor. How do you improve that registration process? Are there things you could do on your phone? Are there things you could do online the night before? How do you do things in that space to improve the patient experience, right? The scheduling process. So now that you've completed whatever procedure you've had done, maybe you need to come back for physical therapy or some nutritional meetings or a follow-up procedure. What does that process look like to get your follow-up meetings sessions scheduled in a timely manner? The horrible, dreaded discharge process. I know all of us can relate to this. The doctor says we're going to discharge you tomorrow. What does tomorrow mean? Is it tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning? Is it noon? Will I get lunch before I'm discharged? Is it going to be 4 o'clock? Is it going to be 7 o'clock at night? How can we streamline that discharge process and at least give a narrower window of when we'll be able to check you out, check your vitals, and get you on your way? Last but certainly not least is the insurance verification process, right? If you schedule a procedure next month, at the time you schedule your appointment, they're going to verify, hey, Manny, let's make sure your insurance is active and that the procedure is covered. But I think, as most of us know, your insurance revalidates on the first of every month. Maybe you change jobs and you're on COBRA. Maybe you change jobs and you have new insurance. Maybe you've changed plans entirely and gone out and purchased something on your own because you've decided to become a consultant. So all of a sudden you show up one day, it's the next month at the hospital, and they say, Manny, this procedure is no longer covered. And all of a sudden you run into chaos. So how do you work with a process to ensure that your insurance is revalidated and there's no gaps, and somebody calls and reaches out to you before that day of your procedure? Here's a specific example in a space where I've worked. It's the operating room turnover. And what is turnover? That's defined as wheels out to wheels in. So somebody goes into an operating room, the first one of the day, it's at 7 o'clock in the morning. Maybe it's for something like carpal tunnel, just to pick something. You're in there for 90 minutes and wheels out. You go into a recovery room for a while. The turnover process is how fast can they turn that room over to get that next patient in that room. And what are all the things that has to be done? The room has to be cleaned and sanitized, all the trash removed, all the surgical equipment that wasn't used has to be removed, and it has to be set up exactly the same way as it was when it was clean and sterile at 7 o'clock in the morning. And so I worked with a team of people, and we got it down from 90 minutes down to 20 or 25 minutes. And it allowed that surgical suite to go from 3 to 5 or more procedures per day. And most either clinics or hospitals, they don't have just one surgical suite. If it's a clinic, they might have 3, 4, 5, 10 surgical suites. So you can imagine, instead of just having 3 per day, how they could do 5 or more per day. It just opens up more volume, more efficiency, more consistent way of doing things. And again, it's a way of using those lean tools, a spaghetti diagram, a SIPOC, a process map. What are all the things we do? What are all the things that we would need to turn that room over? Something that comes to mind is SMED, right? That quick changeover. Maybe some of us have participated in that, that IndyCar, how do you change a tire very quickly? Same kind of idea, but you can apply that to a surgical suite way to turn that over more quickly. Another just very general example is just the process of a treatment life cycle. I think many of us know or have been connected to somebody who at some point they were diagnosed and treated for cancer. And there's many processes that are involved in that space. The diagnosis process. Some people go for a second opinion. It's the treatment selection process. Now that you've talked to the doctor, what's the right course of action? And that becomes a process. Are you going to get chemotherapy? Are you going to get radiation? And then once that's selected, there's what's called the protocol development process. What does that mean? Chemotherapy isn't the same for everybody. What does that protocol look like? Is it 1 infusion every week for 6 weeks? Is it 1 infusion every 3 weeks for 18 weeks? It's developing a process for that particular patient. And then there's the idea of the pre-treatment process. What are the things that have to happen before you walk into that hospital or that clinic or that infusion center? How do we make sure you don't have an elevated temperature? How do you make sure you don't have flu? You don't want to have a compromised immune system prior to getting any one of these treatments because the results could be disastrous. Certainly there's the treatment process of I arrive. I certainly don't want to sit in a waiting room for 2, 3, 4 hours. If I arrive at an infusion center, how do we know that I can be seated quickly, get my infusion, get my meds, and be on my way? And then there's the element of the post-treatment process. How do we ensure that you don't relapse, that you're getting proper hydration, you're getting proper nutrition, that you don't have an elevated temperature? Some things that hospitals look for, they want to reduce a patient length of stay, and they don't want readmission rates, right? You want to get a patient healthy and you want to get them home, but you don't want to put them at risk and get them back because of something that got missed along the way. I want to change gears now and talk a little bit about the legal space. So what is this space and why is it important? So maybe some of us have had to use legal services in the past, maybe not. If you have, you might be familiar with a traditional retainer model, which it really doesn't work the way it used to. It's very adversarial. You might pay a few $1,000s up front. An attorney or a firm works off that rate at an hourly rate, $250 or $500 an hour. And then when they run out of money, if you want them to do more work, you have to pay them more. There are other models that are what they call a fixed fee structure, which was short-lived. It's basically a no-frills model. I'm an attorney and I want, Manny wants me to do work for him. He gives me a flat fee. It's no frills, nothing fancy. Here's the amount you get and that's it. And the more modern model is that partnering with clients in outsourcing some basic commodity work, that's really the way of the future. It's a partnership, it's a relationship, it's not a one-time transaction. And that's the model of the future. So what are those processes that we're looking at in the legal space? So I've came up with a few, and perhaps we can relate to some of them. So one is the client intake process, right? Perhaps I'm an entity and I want to hire a law firm. How do we make sure they get to know me? How big is my firm? What are my risk issues? What are my visions? What are the legal services that I might need? That introductory space of really getting to know and building that relationship. That's a process. There's the new matter intake process. What's that? Well, great. Now that a relationship has been established, oops, something has happened. Somebody is suing my company because they fell down, or whatever product I make has injured them in some way, and they want to sue. So how do we deal with this specific issue? A billing or a fee process. What's the methodology? Am I capturing hours? Is it by issue? Is it because I'm on a monthly retainer? Whatever that might be, how do we make sure that's a clear and transparent relationship? There's the discovery process. How do we learn more information? How do we gather the facts? How do we make sure we have all of the relevant information that we need to be successful? There's the filing process. How do we file motions with opposing counsel? How do we file motions in court? How do we make sure parties are notified appropriately? There's still many legal jurisdictions that still do it by USPS. They mail something, maybe it's certified, but it's a very manual process, and sometimes things slip through the cracks. Court procedures. Every county here in the state of Pennsylvania, I know, they do things a little bit differently. So it's, where are those opportunities to streamline processes for doing things? How do we make sure that in Philadelphia County, where I live, if I'm doing something in Allegheny County, perhaps, which is where Pittsburgh is, how do I make sure that I'm aware of what those procedures are? And then resolution process. Are we going to go to court, or are we going to go to arbitration? And I read an article recently, and it was on, I think it was back in August, and it was on medium.com. And I read it, and this really summed it up for me. And that's the idea of the practice of law and the business of law, that there's a big disconnect. which is why there's such an opportunity in the legal space to streamline operations. The concept of legal ops wasn't something that was widely known 5, 10, 15 years ago, but now it is. There's more and more legal managers, legal operations managers out there. They're starting to learn the tools of lean, be it Gemba, SIPOC, process mapping, process specifications, change management, so that they can go and streamline operations. And certainly, again, the idea of improving the customer experience and improving profitability. Here's one example that I'll share that's challenges for in-house counsel. I like to think that most of us have operated in this space before. So you're in the business and something comes across your desk and you're not quite sure what to do with it. You have some level of uncertainty. So what do? We throw it over the fence and we say, boy, you know what? Let's let legal look at it. You know, we're passing the buck. We're absolving ourselves of responsibility. And in many of the traditional models, the business, when they throw it over, legal will say, you know what? I want to be perceived as playing nice in the sandbox. You know what? I'll deal with this for you. A more modern model is teaching the tools of risk, teaching the tools of a RACI, of a SIPOC, of stakeholder mapping, and giving legal departments the power to question and challenge, you know, is this a business decision or it is a risk call? And if it's a risk call, great. Legal can weigh in, they can do something about it. But if it's a business decision, you know, they can stay out of it and they can say, you know what, they push it back over the fence. And so it's about, you know, minimizing the amount of work that legal is doing and letting them focus on those things that are really the highest risk of an organization and not a business call. Let the business focus on the business and let legal focus on, you know, protecting the organization from any undue risk. All right. So let me switch gears a little bit and just talk about the foundation. So let's go back. We talked at the beginning about the tools of Lean and of Six Sigma and theory of constraints, but really just as a refresher, what are the three pillars? And for me, I think for all of us, right, the first one is reducing and eliminating variation. So some variation may be acceptable, right? If we go to the operating room turnover, that room doesn't have to be turned over in exactly 20 or 21 minutes. We know 20 to 25 minutes is an acceptable amount of variation. And if you reduce variation, it'll give you a predictably bad process, right? You can't run a hospital or a clinic if one time you turned a room over in 20 minutes and the next time it was 90 minutes and the next time it was 15 minutes. How do you get something that's very predictable, right? It could be bad, but at least it's predictable. The next step is about reducing and eliminating waste, right? If you have a predictably bad process at 90 minutes, how do you reduce it to 70, to 60, to 40, to 20? How do you reduce waste? And then certainly last but not least is the space of creating standard work. Who does what? And again, when we talk about who, it's not Manny or Ellen, it's the role. It's the material handler, the environmentalist, the cleaner, whoever it might be. Who, what do they do? Perhaps it's a checklist of things that they do. What's the duration? How long should things take? It's that target condition. They should do this activity and it should take 8 minutes, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 1 hour. And it's having that defined artifact. What does good look like, right? And like sometimes it's a picture on a work instruction, like you saw of the operating theater, like I showed in that diagram. I think those are the key pillars that we all have to keep in mind, you know, whether it's a manufacturing environment or a non-manufacturing environment. And again, I think the focus doesn't just have to be on reducing cycle time, reducing cost, but it's about the customer experience. And I think that's even more important in the non-manufacturing environment, right? It's focused on who's the customer, right? And there's the internal customer and there's the external customer. You know, we talked a little bit already about, you know, in the healthcare space, it's the patient, it's the payer, it's the provider. In the legal space, it's the client, it's the firm, it's the represented party. I think it's extremely important to remember that internally, it's the next step in the process. It's the next person, it's the next group, it's the next department. I want to share one example here that I think really summarizes the idea of the customer experience. And it's something I mentioned in an earlier slide, and it's the idea of accounts payable. Many organizations have a policy or a procedure that says, you know, you submit an invoice and we're going to pay that invoice within 30 or 45 days, whatever the terms are. And many organizations have the belief that they're going to hold on to their cash as long as possible to earn a minimal amount of interest, earn a few pennies. You know, if I owe Manny $300 for work he's done for me and he's invoiced me, you know what? I'm going to wait till that 29th day before I cut a check or initiate an electronic transaction and send it to Manny. And I'm telling you, that's a very poor customer experience. But if I say, you know what, Manny has done an outstanding job, I'm going to get him paid right away, and I pay Manny within 5 or 10 days, sure, I may be losing a few cents of interest, but Manny is going to be a very happy customer. And the next time I want to do some work with Manny and his schedule is busy, he's going to find time to work with me. So that's the idea of, you know, if I've reduced that cycle time and I've wowed Manny, you know, instead of just being a meeting, I've exceeded his expectations. We've gone from a satisfier to a delighter. If you're familiar with the Kano model and what that is a key element to doing repeat business and improving profitability through the customer experience. So a call to action, how do you get started? I would say talk to your leaders, talk to your stakeholders. Identify opportunities that support the core business function. So you may work in a manufacturing environment, but all of these other functions exist. Sales, marketing, human resources, legal, engineering, whatever it might be, those other areas exist. Get some quick wins. Perhaps some of us are familiar with how to do Kaizen events, or GE Workout is another great tool. Some organizations, they call it a tabletop kind of activity. How do you drive work down to the Gemba level, the people that feel the pain every day? How can you get some wins? I would absolutely do that before taking on larger scale opportunities. I don't think when you take this on for the first time, it's a good idea to say, yeah, here's a great project, but it's going to take 12, 18, 24 months. Get some wins, demonstrate that these tools work for commercial processes, and always communicate the link back to the core business functions. You know, if you work on your hiring and onboarding process, you can say, you know what, happy employees, our engaged employees will have less turnover. And those people who work on the manufacturing floor, if we have less turnover, less training to do, and we're going to have more consistent output, throughput, yield, whatever that might be. It's about leadership engagement, and I think all of us are leaders, and I think these 2 points are really important. A team can design the best process without leadership engagement throughout, success can't be achieved. I don't know how many times I've been involved in developing amazing processes with great people, but if you don't have leadership buy-in, you can't implement it and it's not going to stick. I think it's important to build relationships early and often with leaders and stakeholders so that everybody can share in the wins. And like I just said, I think all of us are leaders. Whether you have the title of leader or not, I don't think it really matters. I think some key characteristics of leadership, a vision and a purpose which is shared often. Again, whether you're a senior leader of an organization or you're leading a project, here's the vision of this project. Here's what we're going to do to improve the customer experience. I think empowering people, telling people what and allowing them to figure out how. Delegating and holding people accountable in fair and consistent way. I think listening and being present. You know, put the cell phone down for a few minutes and have that conversation. Asking good questions. You know, tell me more. Emotional intelligence and having empathy. And so why do I share this? I share this because I think my philosophy is there's that intersection between process improvement and leadership, and sometimes even life. And I'm a believer that you can't have one without the other or the third. And you can see the intersection translates into life as well, like I've called out. I think building capabilities and process improvement and leadership also impacts your life outside of the workplace. I think a lot of this sounds like common sense, but I also find that I think common sense does not always translate into common practice. And so I want to just share one quick story, one example of how I think that idea of process improvement and leadership in life all go together. And so here's this notion of Chesterton's fence. And maybe some of you are familiar with it. This was from a book that was written in the 1920s. It has nothing to do with process improvement. It has nothing to do with leadership. And it has everything to do with taking the time to understand the current state. So if you look at this photo here, you see what looks to be an abandoned road, a fence that's in disrepair that seems to have no purpose whatsoever. And let's say perhaps you acquire this piece of land. You might have an instinct to just say, this fence has no purpose, I'm going to just tear it down. And the idea of Chesterton's fence was to take a moment to understand that where you are now served a purpose in the past. It was a solution yesterday that you may not understand it today, but you want to respect the past. You don't want to potentially make things worse by tearing this fence down. Understand, how did you get here? I really don't believe that anybody goes to work and says, boy, I want to create a bad process today. That what exists today, it worked yesterday, last week, last month, and last year. But it's the idea of taking time to understand where we are now before going somewhere. And this, for me, is one of those examples of life that applies to process improvement as well as leadership. And so, in closing, Manny mentioned it in the beginning. The book is only available on Amazon. So I wrote a book. It's been out about a year and a half. It's called Small Doses: Common Sense to Common Practice. It's about that intersection of process improvement, leadership, and life. The book it's 18, I call them thought pieces or chapters. It doesn't have to be read in any order, but it gives you some ideas. It gives some good stories and examples that I think you can apply in your daily life, in your daily work. There's the link if you'd like to make the purchase. It's $15 on Amazon. I've also created a blog, and it's called Smaller Doses, paralleling the theme of small doses. And it's just more stories and examples of leadership and life. It's free. You can get it at smallerdoses.substack.com. If you want to connect with me, so anybody who's technologically savvy, which I'm not, if you have LinkedIn on your phone and you open the app, there's a section in the search bar. If you click on it, a scanner will come up. You can just scan the QR code on your screen and my profile will come up. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, that would be great. If you want to email me, that would be great also. You can also check out my website, jerryrosenthal.com. I'm sure one of the questions that'll come up will be, hey, can I get a copy of your presentation? I would say connect with me on LinkedIn. And just as Manny said, the recording of this presentation, I think will be uploaded in a couple days. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm going to post it to my profile or to a posting. I think I can just upload a PDF. That'll also be there by the end of the week. So if you connect with me, you'll be able to grab that presentation. If you're not on LinkedIn and you don't want to do that, feel free to send me an email and I'll share the presentation with you. I want to thank ASQ LED for inviting me and allowing me to present today. Manny and Ellen, you guys have been great. The entire ASQ LED has been great. And in closing, I'll just say, it's good that you came today. If you want to know more about what that phrase means, I would say check out my blog. The first entry that I did October of last year was a story about that phrase that some of you might find interesting. So let me pause there, and I think we've got a few minutes for some Q&A.
Yes, we do. And we'll take as many questions as we can until the top of the hour. I do want to say that I just checked out the Amazon link. I read the book, but you don't have to take my word for it. 84% of the reviews were 5 stars, and 91% were 4 or 5 stars. That's sort of how I measure. It's over 80%, then it's probably okay for me. So, way to go, Jerry, with 91%. That's pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, a couple of comments, questions, whatnot. First, somebody wrote, loved the photo of the Millennium Park bean. I had to look that up. It's in Chicago, and it's gorgeous pictures. Also, somebody else was talking about some of the other types of costs, cost of poor quality being one. Certainly, that's huge. There's also, for the 8th S, someone suggested sustainability. Now, it's funny because I've heard spirit as well, but gosh, if we're getting to double digits on the S's, that could be interesting.
Yeah, I like that one. I'm going to write that one down. That's a good one. Thank whoever shared that. Thank you. I like that.
So a couple of comments here. Jerry, loving your healthcare and legal ops use cases. Are there any recommendations on podcasts or books which get into similar use cases in industries such as telco with 5G, financial services, transportation, etc.? So I'm not aware of anything off the top of my head, but
yeah, none that come to mind. But I do know there are plenty of people who post on LinkedIn. I know I'm active in a couple of legal groups. There's the ALA, which is what is it? The American Legal Association. That they post very frequently on LinkedIn, and they give some books in that space. I used to be active in the financial sector space, and there are, if you look for lean or process improvement, as well as whether it's financial services or other areas, there's I always see somebody posting, hey, here are my top 5, top 10 books in the space of leadership or in the space of process improvement for those various fields. But I just find that LinkedIn is just a great resource of books and articles and topics in that space.
Sure. Okay. Let's see. Another comment. Now with COVID-19, there was a new challenge in changing processes. We now understand that it's not all about manufacturing, and there's a real need to apply classical manufacturing tools into common day-to-day activities. COVID-19 just advanced this need, and we need to think outside the traditional box. Well, excuse me, the traditional box. Another comment said, common sense is not too common. Here's a question. What kind of Kaizen event metrics do you suggest when starting from scratch is required with new processes in the service industries?
Yeah, so great question. I recently had a conversation with some people around what's the difference between a metric and a KPI. I think very often organizations they conflate the two. So the idea is, all KPIs are metrics, but not all metrics are KPIs. The example I like to teach is clicks on a website, right? If you may click and look at my book, and I can look at the metrics to say, boy, I just had 500 people look at my book today. But how many people click through and actually make the purchase? That might be a KPI, the actual driving it through. So the point I'm making is focus on the critical few. I find many Kaizen events or many teams, they have way too many metrics. What are the critical few? And I call them MAD. What's a MAD? M for meaningful, A for actionable, D that drive the right behavior. How do you find just a few that wind up being levers for everything else? So it's, every service process is different. Again, I like to keep the customer in mind. Is it cycle time? Is it on-time delivery? Is it availability? Is it, is it capacity? There are just a whole variety. I like to keep it very simple, keep it on the critical few, and keep challenging them. You can always take one or two away. You can add one or two, but the idea of having 20 metrics to start with is simply overwhelming. I'd get the group involved and consider it from the perspective of the customer. What would the customer like to see? What's meaningful in that space? That's a good place to start.
Sure. Some more comments. One said, excellent book. Another one says, thanks, Jerry, great presentation. Somebody's asking a question. Can you offer additional resources or direction on change management?
Change management. So, you know, I've studied a few different models. I've never liked the word expert. I'm not an expert. Even in the work that I do, I say I'm a process improvement practitioner. What I've studied is GE has a change model called CAP. You know, ProSci has the ADCAR model, which is a great set of tools. I'm actually reading right now, Nudge is another theory, and I'm actually reading the book right now. Nudge is, you know, is a great, and it's a book that's written with stories. I'm to a point in my life, I just don't like textbooks anymore, but Nudge is a great set of tools on how do you influence others? How do you do good stakeholder engagement? How do you understand the principles of influencing, and how do you do it in a purposeful, meaningful way? So those are the ones that come to mind. You know, ADCAR, Nudge, CAP. McKinsey has a model. I'm familiar with it, but I'm not an expert on it. But those are a few. And you know what? I'll take as an action item within a couple days. I know of a great article that summarizes some great change management models. It's a short article. I'll post it to my LinkedIn as a LinkedIn posting in the next couple days.
Okay. Good presentation, Jerry. 100% agree with you on your principles in your closing session. Is there any use case for looking at processes to justify how many employees can continue to work from home?
Boy, if I only knew. I go to a space. We'll just go back as a snapshot. 12 months ago. If you look back a year ago, I don't know how many organizations would say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, we need we can't hire. We're not hiring remotely. We need somebody who's on premise. We need somebody who's on site." And look how much the world has changed. I think I read an article a couple days ago that Microsoft is going to allow their employees to work remotely indefinitely. So I think you know, one of the chapters in my book is about that line between order and chaos, and that sometimes your things in life just don't change until you step far enough across that line. I think COVID in the last 7 months have pushed all of us across that line, that you can really figure out what you can and can't do remotely. And you know, I'm on Zoom calls or WebEx or Skype or GoToWebinar, you know, 50% of my day, and anything is possible. You can collaborate just about any way through this. But any studies or data, yeah, it's yeah, that's beyond my expertise. We're just kind of figuring it out, you know, fake it till you make it, and I think we're all making it.
Sure. A couple more comments. Thank you for the webinar. One of the things I hear more in academia these days is cutting down cost. My hope is there should also be a talk on looking for avenues to expand revenue. The cost they all talk about is more about reducing labor. Should there be streamlining our operations first? What do you think?
Yeah, so when I first studied and got my green belt and black belt, my coaches were all about cutting costs. It wasn't there, the conversation wasn't there about improving the employee experience. You know, we kind of, you know, jokingly said, you know, what is lean? Lean was less employees are needed, you know, and that never sits well with anybody, because trying to implement a lean culture when people thinking, oh my gosh, you know, we're going to have a 10% headcount reduction, you know, it just doesn't bode well for the culture. So I think it needs to be a balance of both. When I teach and I talk to senior leaders in organizations, I think you need to have a balance of what I call hard savings and soft savings. Hard savings is great. How do you reduce costs? How do you reduce waste? How do you reduce inefficiencies? And great, you work on those projects, but you also need the projects that are the soft savings. How do you improve the employee experience? How do you improve the culture? How do you improve psychological safety in an organization So people say, wow, this is, I'm proud to work here. I'm proud to contribute. This has been a really good onboarding process. I had a really good performance review. My manager really values the work that I do. I think you have to have a balance of both. And that's why I talked a little bit about leadership. I mean, it's hard. You have to continue to influence. And that's what I've continued to do over the last several years. And I have failed many times, but I'm not going to be quiet. I'm going to keep talking about, how do you reduce cost, but also how do you improve that customer, that employee experience? It's not easy.
Sure. A couple more fantastic small doses available for Kindle Unlimited. Here's another one. Thank you, Jerry, for an excellent presentation on non-manufacturing areas. Here's another one. What is your opinion on which metric to follow? Number of COVID cases per day, number of COVID-related deaths per day, or any other metrics?
Boy, so I have to provide the disclaimer that I didn't go to medical school. I didn't finish medical school. I've worked for many years around many doctors, many PhDs, many people much smarter than I am. I don't know what the right metric is. I don't know what the right statistic is. I think there are some that you have to look at in terms of the totality. There's certainly the bias that says, oh, great, the number of cases increasing per day, but also the number of tests that are available per day is also increasing. So is it a scaled model? The number of deaths, when I look at that, there's the element of, are we really sure it's a death because of COVID, or is it a death because of some comorbidity issue? I don't know, and I don't want to offer an opinion. I just know it's very challenging, especially if you are in a state such as New Jersey or New York or just places right now that are hot spots. I don't know what the right metric is anymore. It's very confusing for even those of us that consider ourselves amateur statisticians.
I think possibly it depends on what you're trying to measure. If you're looking at transmission rates, sure, then you look at number of COVID cases per day, but as you said, tests are increasing, so that number goes up.
Sure, I could always also look at what's the revenue that the federal government is giving to hospitals, right? If you look at revenue, now all of a sudden you see something a little different, because every COVID case is getting some element of reimbursement from the federal government. So I'm not implying that there's an incentive. I want to put that out there, that there's an incentive to say, oh, so and so passed away from COVID, but financial measures are also another way to measure this and understand what's going on. I'm just saying, just putting it out there.
Right, absolutely. There's a few more excellent presentation, thank you, Jerry, type things. I think one last question. Do you think there should be a balance between process automation software and people?
Yes. Great question. It goes to, and I actually wrote a chapter in a book early this year about the magic bullet. So I don't believe that companies should just say, oh, look at that, I want AI or I want RPA, and they go out and they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars without being crystal clear on what's the process, what are they trying to achieve. Is there some good AI out there? Absolutely. Is there a way for AI to do some automated commodity type of work that will reduce labor? Absolutely. Does balance always mean 50-50? It doesn't, but I do think all organizations should at least look at it and not necessarily jump to the conclusion of, I want to buy something AI, but it's understanding what your process capabilities are, what your voice of the employee is, what your return on investment would be, and try something that might be a good fit. I agree, absolutely. I think it should absolutely be considered, and I think it will continue to improve over the next few years. But I think that's very wise.
All right, Jerry. On behalf of LED, I would like to say thank you. Really great presentation. And I mean, if I wish I could read all the comments to you, but we're a little bit over time now, so I'm going to stop the recording and said you'll be able to see it on ASQ's LED channel on YouTube. So thanks again, Jerry.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Wishing all a good afternoon and good week.